All right, guys, what's going on? It's Jack, and welcome back to another video. So, earlier today, the Ghost of Eight, also known as Eight Thoughts, made a video talking about, well, it was titled Call of Duty is Dead, Skill-Based Matchmaking and Cheating Will Never Stop. And in that video, and I'm paraphrasing here, he was basically talking about how, how we're the minority, which I 100% agree with, and basically a lot of people were stomping on lobbies and we're in the minority, and basically the 90% of players or 80% of players are always going to outweigh us, and they are always going to cater to them. So therefore skill-based matchmaking, engagement optimized matchmaking, and cheating and all that kind of stuff is just never going to stop because of that. And he has a point, right? And how things are never going to change. And I have something else that I want to put into the mix in accordance to a certain degree of what he said, but it's actually going to relate and translate over to XDefiant. Now, we know that XDefiant at the end of the day is basically an alternative Call of Duty. Whether you like to admit that or not, it is the truth. It is an alternate Call of Duty one way or another. And I want you to keep that in mind during the course of this commentary. And I also want you to keep in mind that you and I watching these types of videos, playing the amount that we've played over the years, whether it was Call of Duty or whatever type of shooter that you enjoy to play, the upcoming XDefiant, whatever it is, players like you watching this video are actually, believe it or not, the minority. Sure, there are a few people that might be, very casual that happen to stumble upon this video or whatnot. But again, those numbers are significantly a much lower percentage than the players that are the quote-unquote hardcore players, just like the hardcore players that put certain franchises like Call of Duty where they ended up being in terms of their success are now the minority because things have changed and things have been implemented. But anyway, the thing that I want to get into is that now I just basically paraphrase of what he said in his video, right? And he's not exactly wrong. He does have a point. But it may not be like 100% totally wrong. But overall, when you look at the fact that it's not going to change, the one part that he's 100% right is that, number one, we are the minority. And number two, it's not going to change because of the fact that we're the minority and they have to cater to their casuals. So therefore, they're not going to change anything. Okay, 100% agree. However, there's one thing that I specifically remember about Call of Duty and how it's going to translate up to the upcoming XDefiant, and as to why we should keep our expectations low about XDefiant so that way we're not heartbroken yet again, because as a Call of Duty community, the players have been the hardcore player base has been heartbroken time and time and time again. Okay, and that doesn't mean that XDefiant has immunity to that, and I'm about to say why here in a minute. Now, with Call of Duty, players, whether you were a hardcore player or whether you were a casual, chances are you were playing like back in the day when Call of Duty was reasonably fresh and new and within its heyday, within its prime. People would actually play the new installation, which came out every year, of course, during the entirety of its life cycle, right? But then after a while, and this was even before skill-based matchmaking was introduced into pubs, right? Before that, there came a time where the game wouldn't be played for the entirety of its life cycle anymore, right? There wouldn't be, and this would happen more as time went on. Like back in the day during its prime, Call of Duty used to be played during the entirety of its life cycle, and this was even before DLC and before changes to the game modes and stuff like that. People would play Call of Duty during the entirety of its life cycle, and hell, even beyond its life cycle, because people loved that iteration so much that they would either stick with it or come back to it or whatever the deal was, right? Okay, then, despite the fact that we were still getting solid Call of Duty games, we didn't play for the entirety of the life cycle anymore. Now, remember, we're talking about the vast majority of players here. Those of us that are like the minority, like you and I watching this video, you would still play the game. But like for me personally, yes, I would still play the game, but it wasn't as enjoyable as it was when it was a lot more fresh, if that makes any sense, right? So therefore, you start playing the game less, or it starts becoming more like a chore. At least that's how it felt to me. I can't speak for the rest of the majority of the hardcore fan base or whatever, but anyway, back on topic. So over time, the game would go from lasting one whole year of its entirety of the life cycle to 9 months, then to 6 months, and nowadays it seems to be that, players start dropping down after the first few months, right? If not, maybe even slightly sooner, right? And if the past, before we had skill-based matchmaking, in the past, if we were getting solid Call of Duty games without skill-based matchmaking, if that was still happening, and if players weren't playing as consistent as they once were, or not putting in as many total hours as they once were, then why is that? If skill-based matchmaking wasn't where it is today, right? And if it wasn't a thing back then, but yet players were still playing less, then what happened? Despite the fact that the games were good, what happened? Here's my theory. My theory is that we got cotted the fuck out. Like, we were playing the game a lot, and at first when it was new and fresh, we couldn't get enough of it. We couldn't stop playing it. And then a few years down the line, despite the fact that we were getting new games every year, and despite the fact that there were new weapons, new guns, and all that kind of stuff, essentially, if you think about it, it was pretty much a similar experience time and time again. And I think what happened was that the game itself wasn't having that same dopamine effect like it once did. And so therefore players started playing less. And then what did they do? They started putting in DLC, and then they started doing the loot box thing. And then after the loot box thing became, no more, then of course they started introducing engagement optimized matchmaking, or team balancing, or versions of it, or whatnot. And in some cases both at the same time, namely advanced warfare, right? Because they wanted to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted people to buy the loot boxes, right, or microtransactions, and at the same time they wanted to increase player retention, so therefore skill-based matchmaking was introduced. And that is when it was first, like, when it was really, like, when it stuck to it, like when no matter how much players cried, but they still kept it in the game. Advanced Warfare, to my knowledge, was like the iteration of that. Because in Black Ops 2, I think it was mentioned that they had it in Black Ops 2, and then the community bitched about it so much that that they removed it. I don't remember this because back during when Black Ops 2 first came out, I sucked at the game. It wasn't until like the second half of its life cycle to where I started getting better, and then, whatever. But I think it was the same thing, comparable to kind of like, let's say, drugs, for instance, right? You build up a tolerance to certain drug, and then what ends up happening? You end up needing a higher dose to get the same effect, right? Well, the same thing is going on with Call of Duty. They're trying to give us a higher dose, and when they ran out of ideas, when they stopped going, they went from boots on the ground to advanced movement, and then from advanced movement back to boots on the ground, and then they started putting in all these other ideas or whatnot, and then they went to realism and all that. When they started running out of ideas, and when all the loot boxes and stuff like that were no more and everything, they started introducing engagement optimized matchmaking because there was nothing else that they could do in order to keep players playing longer. So they made a matchmaking system that became centered around addiction, so therefore keeping the majority of players, which are your average players, engaged in the game, so therefore increasing their chances of buying microtransactions and everything else that's in the game, like the bundles and stuff like that, because that is where a very huge chunk of the money is coming in. That is significantly more than just buying the game itself at $70. Believe it or not, at the end of the year, it adds up. If you were to spend $10 a month, it adds up to $120 at the end of the year, on top of the $70 that you're paying for the game at nearly $200. And that's just for $10 a month, which is on the lower end. Some of these bundles are over $30 freaking dollars, dude. And then let's not mention things like battle passes and all that kind of stuff. It's like, yeah, no wonder they made all the content free, because it's the microtransactions, and the microtransactions sell. So ultimately what I'm trying to tell you is that my theory is this, that with XDefiant, we've been there before, right? Whether you like to admit it or not, XDefiant is an alternate Call of Duty, right? And it may be a very solid one with good intentions, no SBMM in anything in pubs except for the welcome playlist, and of course in ranked. So, good intentions with a good game that's going to be free to play with all the bells and whistles, and of course with additional content coming every 3 months, et cetera, support by the devs, all that stuff. Okay, great. But at the same time, don't forget, Call of Duty also had this in the past. And that in and of itself was not enough to keep players playing year around. Do you see a pattern going on here? Now, again, XDefiant would be the only game of its kind as of right now at this point in time to not have SBMM in pubs. But let's not forget that that could change. This could very well change over time. Mark Rubin himself has, even as an executive producer, even he has limits and he has a boss. So he has somebody to answer to, and he can't say whatever he wants when he wants. He has to get permission, and he has to wait for a certain time and to get the green light in order to do so. You know what I mean? So if his higher ups, one of the executives, right, at Ubisoft say, you know what? We're bleeding players way too fast with this game. We need to put engagement optimized matchmaking into this game because players are dropping way too fast, and we need to implement this in order to slow down the bleeding or stop the bleeding, so that way we can maximize profits, because the executives only understand profits. They do not understand anything else. Unless the executives themselves are similar to like some of the executives over at Nintendo that have actually worked in the business as a game developer and kind of climbed up the ladder and now are higher up, and they truly have firsthand experience as to what it is to be not just a gamer, but a game developer as well. And that's the problem with a lot of executives today. Like, a lot of these executives in certain positions have either stopped playing video games or don't play video games at all, and they're just looking at the business side of it. And that's how actually they get hired in certain cases as well. Not all of them are a part of the gaming business. The guy that was in charge of PlayStation before Jim Ryan, PlayStation was doing a lot better because this guy actually, grew up in the field and is actually a gamer and all that kind of stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously I would argue whether or not Jim Ryan actually plays games. But you guys get the point here, right? It's kind of like being a personal trainer, but yet not having trained a day in your life. And you see what I'm saying? So anyway, at the end of the day, with XDefiant, we've been there before. We've been there before with Call of Duty. We had the experience year after year. We had all the bells and whistles, but that in and of itself wasn't enough to stop the population from starting to get caught out. It's as simple as that. And that is why things like microtransactions, engagement optimized matchmaking, and things designed in the game that revolve around those two things, around the microtransactions, the battle pass, and the engagement optimized matchmaking, that is what gets games to die down for us, specifically for us hardcore fans, so to speak, the ones that are passionate, the ones that have played the genre for years, right? We're the ones that end up paying the most. We're the ones that suffer the most because, quite frankly, we're the minority. So what I'm trying to tell you is, with XDefiant, keep your expectations low and keep everything within logic. Because sometimes I know we can get excited about things so much that we throw logic out the window and we're just enjoying the dopamine effect of this game coming out without the SBMM, and it's going to be just like the old days and all that kind of stuff. And one more thing I wanted to mention is that when you look at, for instance, single player games that are remasters of games 20 years ago, let's say Dead Space, right? Back in the day when it first came out, Dead Space was the shit. And all these years later, in the year 2023, Dead Space Remastered came out and everybody absolutely loved it. It was a success and all that kind of stuff. Great. But after a few weeks or so after that game released, everything about that has gone dead silent. And it's the same thing when it comes to multiplayer games, except it lasts a little bit longer before things go dead silent. For like, let's say Dead Space Remake, it lasted a few weeks to a month in terms of its maximum hype and the amount of players that were playing it, et cetera, et cetera. People were talking about it, content creation, stuff like that. Okay. But with multiplayer games, it lasts a little bit longer. And then after that, the same effect happens. And remember, the reason why I'm comparing it to a remake or remastered all these years later is because if you think about it, XDefiant is basically like classic Call of Duty the way it used to be. However, we've been there before, and don't be surprised if that hype and that nostalgia and that desire to play the game nonstop disappears. Now, obviously, for a lot of us, again, we're in the minority, right? A lot of you people watching this video are in the minority, so therefore you probably will continue to play the game. But at the same time, that may not be the case for a lot of other players out there, whether they're hardcore players or not. And we can't ignore historic facts like I've mentioned time and time again in multiple videos. Call of Duty, when it was in its heyday, at first, for the first few years, lasted the entirety of its life cycle. Then it went down to like 6 to 9 months, and then eventually down to 3 months to where we are now, if that. So let's not forget about it. Okay. So just saying that uh, if XDefiant does fail, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's XDefiant's fault or that it's a bad game or anything like that. It's just because of the fact that we've had it year after year with Call of Duty before, and with XDefiant getting it again, even though it's years later and such. Again, we've been there before. It won't take. I personally don't think it'll be too long before a lot of people, including the hardcore audience, gets bored again. Some of you guys out there may be in the very minority to where you'll play it nonstop and you'll never get tired of it, and I'm happy for you. But remember, you're in the minority. So if the majority of the player base ends up getting bored because they've been there before, or whatever the deal may be, or maybe because 8 Thoughts' theory might be true as well, because they're tired of getting stomped or whatever the deal is, guess what? In order to save the game in terms of numbers, that is when things like SBMM or EOMM get introduced into pubs, or at least a possibility. And there's no developer out there that's immune to it. There's no developer that's immune to it at all. Even single player developers are not immune to the effects of it. I mean, look at what happened with Rocksteady. They were doing some of the best games ever with the Batman Arkham series, and now for whatever reason they went with a very, very repetitive and very bad, piss poor excuse of a game that was to be a yet a single player or a co-op game or whatnot, filled with it was supposed to be like a live service game, right? And yet, if you look at Angry Joe's review of that game, you will see just how repetitive it was and how bad it really is. And like playing the same boss fight over and over again with just a different coat and stuff like that. Like, that's just the tip of the iceberg, guys. So trust me when I tell you, not even single player games are immune to this type of way now. So, but in terms of what happened with Suicide Squad, it's a good thing because, quite frankly, that game bombed. And, you know, since these not the developers, but since these executives only understand the bottom dollar, well, they're going to know that they did something wrong. And hopefully they change things in the right direction, because they may fuck up again. You never know. But anyway, I just wanted to make this video to kind of keep our expectations within reason when it comes to XDefiant, and just kind of remind people of the truth and of historic facts, so that way there's not too many broken hearts out there. I'm trying to save some hearts here, folks. But with that being said, you know, I do want the game to succeed, but at the same time, I'm keeping my expectations low, to be honest with you. And it's as simple as that. So let me know down in the comment section what you guys think. And I really appreciate the time to watch that you guys have taken to watch and or listen to this video. And I'll catch you guys on the next one.